You are useless, Mom. A steaming hot cup of coffee was thrown straight at my chest. It was no accident. It was deliberate, meant to hurt. Every drop that splashed onto my dress burned. Not just my skin, but the last bit of dignity I had left. The one who threw that cup of coffee was my son-in-law. If someone told you that they were humiliated by their own family, you might not believe it. But here I am, at 75 years old, standing in California, ready to tell you a true story, one that you will not be able to look away from. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply turned around and started walking out of the house I once called home. But stay until the end of this video, because what I did next forced that entire family to bow their heads in shame. If you have ever felt disrespected, pushed aside, or invisible in your own family, then this story is for you. Click that subscribe button so we can share the stories that need to be heard. My name is Martha Louise Campbell. I used to be an elementary school teacher in Fresno, California, a place full of sunshine and kind-hearted people that made me believe I had lived a decent, meaningful life. After my husband Henry passed away from cancer, I moved in with my only daughter, Emily, and her husband Brian. I never wanted to be a burden. I thought, if I cooked, cleaned, and helped take care of my grandson, then maybe, just maybe, there would still be a place for me in their lives. Emily used to be the little girl who hugged her mom every night before bed. But now, she just stayed silent whenever her husband snapped at me. Brian had a good job and a pleasant face in front of others, but behind closed doors, he was someone else. Cold, critical, arrogant. I started to feel like I was invisible in the very kitchen I cooked in, the living room I cleaned, but I kept quiet. I endured it. For my grandson, little Lucas. He was the only reason I stayed. Until one day, Brian decided to kick the dead weight out of his life. Literally. It all started on a morning like any other. I was folding Lucas's clothes when Brian stormed into the living room with a scowl on his face. He picked up a shirt and saw a tiny wrinkle. "Can you not do anything right? Do you even know how much of our time you waste?" Before I could say a word, he threw his hot coffee straight at me. Emily stood nearby. She turned away. I stood there, frozen. They did not just ask me to leave. They made it legal. The next day, I received eviction papers from the house I had been helping pay rent for over the past 3 years. Brian had his lawyer prepare everything in advance. Emily said nothing. She simply placed an envelope with $200 on the table and took Lucas out for a walk in the park. I left that house with a small suitcase, an old photo album, and a heart in pieces. I had nowhere to go. I found a small church on the edge of town and asked if I could stay for the night. The priest did not ask many questions. He just looked into my eyes and said, "Sometimes you have to lose everything to know what you truly deserve." That night, I slept with the sound of church bells in the distance and a promise in my heart I would not let my silence be an excuse for someone else's cruelty. The next morning, I walked to the nearest public library. I started researching, digging into the legal rights of elderly tenants in California. I discovered that if I had contributed to the rent, even without my name on the lease, I had the right to challenge an unfair eviction. I contacted a legal aid office that supported senior citizens. I told them my story, and they offered to help me for free. The attorney assigned to me, her name was Rachel, was the first person to ever say something to me that I would never forget. "You are not a victim. You are living proof of injustice, and you have every right to fight back." We started collecting evidence, bank statements, text messages, testimony from neighbors. I learned how to file documents, organize expenses, and write formal complaints. I also started teaching again, but this time online, for children with disabilities. With the little money I earned, I rented a tiny room near the Mexican market. I cooked for myself, grew herbs in small pots by the window, and every day I rewrote my life story. As for Brian and Emily, they had no idea I was quietly making a comeback, and even less of a clue that the storm they had stirred was about to circle back around. One evening, I received an email from Rachel. The subject line read, "Case qualifies for civil litigation." I sat still for a while, not because I was scared, but because I had never imagined that a 75-year-old woman, all alone, could take the people who hurt her to court and have a real shot at winning. But this was not about revenge. It was about restoring my dignity. And above all, it was about sending a message to every person ever mistreated by their own family. You are not invisible, and you are definitely not useless. Over the next 3 months, Rachel and I prepared thoroughly. I recorded Brian's verbal abuse through a neighbor's doorbell camera. I requested copies of the bank transfers I had made to Emily when they were struggling. Some nights I was exhausted from reading legal texts. Some mornings I smiled through tears, reading texts from old neighbors saying they were ready to testify because they had heard Brian's hateful words through the windows more than once. I even found a non-profit organization that supports elderly women suffering from emotional abuse. They agreed to cover part of the legal costs and connected me with counseling services. For the first time, I sat across from a professional and said, "I do not need pity. I just need someone to give me a chance to be heard." And they listened. Finally, the court date arrived. I wore the dark blue dress I had saved from my husband's funeral, not to mourn again, but to remind myself that I had survived the worst. And now, it was time to live according to my worth. Brian walked into the courtroom with a slick lawyer. He gave a cold smile, like this was just some legal joke. But that joke was about to become his nightmare. Right before the hearing began, Rachel handed me a copy of their previous year's tax filing, a document she had obtained through a legal channel. It clearly showed that I had contributed over $18,000 over the course of 3 years to help with rent, tuition, even car insurance. I had never kept the receipts, but the bank remembered, and now every number became evidence. When the judge asked, "What do you have to prove you were more than just a guest?" I calmly handed over the statements and the audio from the doorbell, where Brian called me a worthless freeloader. Across the courtroom, I saw Brian look confused and turn to Emily. She looked down, and for the first time in years, I saw shame in my daughter's eyes. I walked out of that courtroom, not with pride, but with a strange sense of peace. It was not the silence of someone defeated, but the silence of someone who had survived, a woman who had gone through the storm and did not break. I did not go straight back to my rental room. Instead, I stopped by an old bookstore on the corner of Spring and Olive, a place I once took Emily when she was just 10 years old. I picked up a slim book on meditation, flipped it open at random, and saw a line underlined in ink. "No suffering is meaningless if you are brave enough to listen to it." So I chose to listen to myself. I signed up for a pottery class for seniors at the community center in Little Tokyo. At first, it was just something to fill the emptiness, but slowly, each lump of clay taught me patience, how to shape with care, and how even cracks could be part of something beautiful. I never told anyone about the lawsuit. I did not post anything online. I let the legal system do its part, while I quietly healed in my own way. Every morning, I woke up at 6 o'clock, followed a gentle yoga routine led by an 82-year-old Indian woman on YouTube. Then I watered my plants, brewed a cup of hot tea, and began to write. I did not write to complain. I wrote to record my journey of rising up. I started a small blog called Letters from Martha. In it, I shared little stories, how I overcame a panic attack at the grocery store, or the first time I dared to wear the red dress again, the one Brian once said was not appropriate for someone my age. To my surprise, each post was shared thousands of times. Women from Kansas, from Maine, even from New Mexico began writing to me. They told me they had been called useless, had been forgotten, or had been hurt by the very people they loved the most. They said they felt seen through my story, and I, in return, felt alive through theirs. A women's organization in Los Angeles contacted me and invited me to speak at a seminar called Silence is No Longer an Option. I stood on that stage, my hands shaking slightly, but my voice steady. I once believed silence was a way to keep the peace, but I have learned that silence can be a partner to cruelty. Today, I do not stand here to share sadness. I stand here to share rebirth. The room was completely silent. Then everyone stood and applauded. I was old, but for the first time in my life, I no longer felt invisible. And that is something Brian and Emily could never take back. I was no longer the woman who stayed quiet out of fear of losing her family. I was now a woman who had redefined herself, quietly but powerfully. A few months after that seminar, I received a handwritten letter from a young woman in Sacramento. She wrote that her mother had recently passed away from heart disease, but before she died, they read my blog together every night as a kind of peaceful ritual. She wrote, "Thank you, because you made my mother feel like she was not alone." I cried when I read that, not out of sadness, but from the deep realization I had once believed my life ended in the backyard of my daughter's house, but it turns out that was only the transition from one chapter to another, a deeper, more beautiful, and more truthful chapter. I used to think my worth was in serving others, in hot meals and babysitting. But now, I understand, our value lies in standing up again, even when no one else is standing beside you. I no longer try to be accepted by Emily or Brian. I have learned to accept myself, fully, bravely, and in peace. I began receiving calls from community organizations. Some invited me to share my experience. Others asked me to host a radio show for seniors. I declined most of them, not out of fear, but because I had chosen a different path, a quiet life, but one filled with meaning. I returned to volunteering at the city library, the same one where I once taught reading to low-income children nearly 30 years ago. Now, I was teaching elderly people how to write. Every trembling stroke on the page was another wound being healed. One afternoon, while reading a book at Grand Park, an older woman sat beside me and asked, "Do you live alone?" I smiled and said, "No, I live with a lot of stories." To some, that might sound like a cliché, but to me it was the truth. Every blog post, every class, every letter from a stranger, they had become my new community, a family I was not born into, but one I chose, and one that chose me back. I also found a group of older friends who shared a love for writing. We met every Saturday for coffee, took turns reading aloud our latest paragraphs, and no one judged anyone. They knew my story, not because I told them, but because they had read it. And no one asked about Brian or Emily. They only asked, "Did you write something new this week?" That kind of gentle curiosity made me feel respected. For the first time in a very long time, one day, as I watered the lavender pots in front of my porch, I saw a woman standing across the street. It was Emily, thinner, messy hair, holding a paper bag. She stared at me, her eyes watery. But just as I moved to open the gate, she turned and walked away, quickly, as if staying one more second might cause her to collapse. I did not chase after her. I simply placed a letter, one I had written long ago but never sent, into the mailbox. In the letter, I did not scold. I simply wrote, "If one day you need a place to sit quietly and take a deep breath, the old house still has a space for you. Gracias. But you must come as a kind person, not as a shadow of the past." I began a new ritual every Sunday morning, walking a lap around Echo Park Lake with only a small notebook and a purple ink pen. I wrote everything. A duckling that got separated from its flock, the smile of a young mother, the eyes of a homeless man sitting silently on a wooden bench, all of it became raw material for my writing and fuel for my soul's rebirth. I never thought I would one day be grateful, even for the things that once caused me the deepest pain. But the more I wrote, the more I taught, the more I lived among people who had also been broken, the more I understood pain, when healed the right way, becomes a wellspring of renewal. One time, while helping an elderly woman write her name for the first time in over 70 years, she asked me, "How do you forgive without feeling weak?" I answered, "Forgiveness is not about letting others off the hook. It is about setting yourself free from the chains of anger." I do not know if she fully understood, but her eyes lit up, the same way mine once did in the mirror on the first morning after leaving Brian's house, when I finally dared to say to myself, I can start again. I also began receiving invitations to write for community magazines, especially those focused on elderly women and immigrants. They did not need dramatic tales. They just wanted honesty from someone who had hit rock bottom, then quietly swam her way back to the surface. And in every piece I wrote, I always left one final line. If you are reading this through tears, just know you are not alone. A 75-year-old woman like me no longer needs a spotlight, but I know my voice, if it is true enough, deep enough, can be a small candle to light the way for someone still wandering through the dark. And to me, that is a life truly fulfilled. One day, Rachel, my attorney, called me, her voice nearly bursting with excitement. "Martha, the court has agreed to reopen the case under the grounds of protecting senior citizens' rights. We now have a real chance to make Brian face the truth." At that moment, I was tending to the lavender bushes on my front porch. I froze for a few seconds, then gently replied, "I never thought I would get another chance to speak up. But now, I am ready." The following weeks were filled with determined preparation. Rachel and I gathered every piece of evidence we had: bank statements, the doorbell recordings, witness accounts from neighbors, and even handwritten letters from those who had seen Brian's blatant contempt toward me. The official hearing took place on a cold February morning. I walked into the courtroom wearing a thick ash-gray coat. It belonged to my late husband. I wanted him to be present in the moment I finally stood up for myself. Brian showed up with a new attorney. He no longer looked smug. He looked like someone who had not slept for several nights. Neither of us smiled. We simply sat across from each other, like two worlds that no longer intersected. During the trial, Rachel clearly presented the facts that I had consistently contributed financially over the course of 3 years, amounting to no less than $18,000, and that I had never been allowed to sign any agreement before being evicted. She submitted the audio recordings, along with the deeply emotional testimony I had written, to be read aloud in court. When it was my turn to speak, I said only one sentence: "I am not here to reclaim a home. I am here to reclaim my voice." The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge, a woman in her early 60s, looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You have done what very few dare to do, turn silence into action." The trial ended with a ruling in my favor. Brian was ordered to pay compensation for damages to my reputation and cover all legal expenses. But the most important outcome, the entire case was made public record, setting a legal precedent for similar cases in the future. As I stepped out of that courtroom, I did not feel triumphant, nor did I cry. I simply felt something I had lost for a long time, a kind of freedom in my soul finally return. When I got home that day, still holding the court's decision in my hands, I sat for a long time on the porch, quietly watching the late afternoon sky glow orange. The yard was covered in fallen leaves, but I did not sweep them away. I just sat there, feeling a kind of peace that was new to me, not because justice had won, but because I no longer flinched at the sound of Brian's name. A week later, I received a thick envelope from Rachel's office. Inside was a copy of a leaked email. Brian had been fired from his position as regional director at his company for ethical violations and severe damage to organizational reputation. News of the lawsuit had quietly circulated among the internal corporate network. I did not laugh, but I exhaled deeply, relieved. Emily still had not called, but I was not waiting anymore. I understood now that each person awakens in their own time. As for me, I had walked every step of the path I needed to walk, with legs that once trembled, now strong enough to stand alone. The local newspaper ran an editorial with the headline, "75-year-old woman turns pain into legal precedent." I was not used to attention, but one evening, as I was grocery shopping, a woman in her 40s came up to me, took my hand and said, "You are the reason I no longer feel ashamed for walking away from my toxic in-laws." I hugged her, and in that moment I understood. Sometimes the most important thing is not just that you survive, but that you pass the flame of survival to someone else. In the days that followed, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder protection. I stood before hundreds of people and shared my journey. No script, no bravado, just a story, told simply and from the heart. And when I ended my speech with the words, "I was once scolded by a thrown cup of coffee, but what hurt more than the burn was the way my own daughter looked away," the room went completely still, then erupted in thunderous applause. In that moment, I knew I had not only reclaimed my dignity, I had reclaimed my right to exist, fully and unconditionally, in this life. A few months after the court victory, I unexpectedly received a letter from a private hospital in San Diego. The sender was Brian. I had to read the opening lines 3 times before I could believe it was his handwriting. "I know I do not deserve forgiveness, but I cannot carry this silence to the end of my life." He wrote about his heart condition, complications brought on by months of stress, sleepless nights, and panic attacks. No more job, no more reputation, no more friends. Emily had separated from him and taken Lucas back to her hometown to live with his paternal grandparents. Brian was alone, drifting in a temporary rental apartment, with no one to care for him. He said that every night he dreamed of me, standing in the living room, soaked in coffee, my face blank and wordless. "Your eyes that day haunt me more than any nightmare ever could." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I did not respond. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I understood. Some wrongs do not need punishment, because they are already a lifelong sentence. A week later, I received news that Brian had been readmitted to the hospital, alone, and one of the nurses on night duty passed along a message through an acquaintance. "He keeps calling out your name in his sleep." I almost went, but then I did not. That afternoon, I sat by the window for hours, holding a cup of ginger tea, my eyes gazing into the distance. There was no bitterness in me, just an emptiness, where something once loomed large, now reduced to a lesson. I quietly lit a small candle, not for Brian, but for myself, to remind me that I had made it through, with a depth of compassion that no one ever thought an old woman labeled useless could possibly have. Some weeks later, I received an unexpected gift, a pencil drawing of an old woman reading a book in the park. Her face looked strikingly like mine. In the bottom corner, scribbled in a child's handwriting, "I hope to see you again." No name, no return address, but I knew it was from Lucas. I sat for a long time with that drawing. It needed no words, just presence, a small hand reaching out, not from the apologies of adults, but from the pure, unbroken love of a child. And strangely, I did not cry. I smiled, placing the drawing in a frame beside an old photo of me and Emily when she was little. Not to hold on to the past, but to remind myself, in this life, there are things that hurt so deeply they will never be forgotten. But that does not mean they cannot be forgiven. I do not know what will happen to Brian. I am not sure Emily will ever have the courage to return. But I know one thing: a circle is slowly closing, not by revenge, but by a quiet kind of power, the power of kindness after the storm. One afternoon, while reorganizing my bookshelf, I came across an old journal, the one I kept during the days after being cast out of their house, the shaky, uneven handwriting of a woman in despair. I reread every page, as if watching a film where I was the lead, not to relive the pain, but to prove that I never gave up. The final page of that journal had been left blank. That day, I picked up a pen and wrote just one line. The day I became free. Not the day I won in court, not the day Brian apologized. But the day I realized I had walked through every shadow without losing my compassion. Since Lucas's drawing, I have started receiving small postcards, no return address. One showed a beach, another a wooden bridge in the forest, each with just a few short lines. Are you well, Grandma? I got an A in science today. I miss the apple pie you used to make. I do not know if Emily allows him to write, but I know that somewhere in that boy's heart, the memory of his grandmother still lives, warm and unshaken. One autumn morning, as I was watering my lavender pots, I saw a figure across the street. It was Emily. That same slender figure, those same expressive eyes, but this time, no longer cold. She did not come in. She did not call out. She just stood there, as if silently asking herself whether she should cross the space built by years of silence. I smiled. I did not wave. I did not say her name. But I knew if one day she finds the courage to take that step forward, the door will always be open. And I understood. The harshest punishment is not the one handed down by a judge, but the late, aching realization that you once walked away from the person who loved you the most. But I will not be the one to judge. I choose to be the one who lights the lamp, so that if one day Emily or Lucas returns, they will still see the way home. These days, I live in a small house, just big enough for one person and a few flower pots. Every morning, I wake up early, open the window, brew a pot of chamomile tea, and write a few lines in my journal. No more words choked with pain. Only a quiet kind of gratitude remains. I no longer need apologies. I am no longer waiting for anything. The only thing I have chosen to keep is peace. Those who once hurt me are now just names that no longer weigh on my heart. I have not forgotten them, but I do not live for them anymore. I live for myself. And I live fully. Someone once asked me, "How do you forgive someone who treated you like you were nothing?" I simply replied, "Because I was never nothing. I was never useless. I was just misplaced. Now I am exactly where I belong, in the light, among kindness, and with people who truly listen. I did not get revenge. I did not become bitter. And that is the greatest victory of my life. I have learned to love the little things, the sound of sparrows chirping by the wooden fence, the smell of toast drifting from the kitchen, the soft rustle of autumn wind moving through the trees. There are days when I do absolutely nothing, just sit by the window and listen as life passes by, gently. Every so often I receive letters from women I have never met. They tell me their stories of quiet pain, stifling marriages, children who grew up and no longer see their mothers as people. I read every word, gently fold the letters, and place my hand over my heart, as if embracing them from afar. I have started hosting small gatherings on Sunday afternoons, right in my garden. No stage, no microphones, just a few wooden chairs, some cups of tea, and women brave enough to come, to share, to cry, to breathe. We call them afternoons of coming home to ourselves. None of us are perfect, but all of us are learning to heal. And in the broken, scattered stories, I have found the most beautiful thing. We are no longer ashamed of having been hurt. One day, as I was reading on my porch, Lucas showed up, out of nowhere. No warning, no drama. He simply stood there, holding a bundle of wild daisies and looking at me with those dark eyes, just like Emily's when she was little. "I brought you apple pie. I made it myself." I said nothing. I just opened my arms and held him close, as if there had never been a winter between us. And when I looked into his eyes, I did not see the past anymore. I saw a future, a glimmer of hope, still whole and untouched. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever been called useless, simply because you are no longer young, no longer earning money, or no longer needed? If this story touched something in you, leave a comment. Share your own story, because when we dare to speak up, we are no longer alone. I am a 75-year-old woman. I was once kicked out of my home, called a burden, and I once believed my life was over. But today, I am still here, with a heart no longer filled with resentment, with a soul stitched back together from the very pieces that once broke. And I tell this story, not to complain, but to say this to you. You do not need revenge. Your peace is the most powerful answer. If you believe this story deserves to be heard, click like, share it with someone who needs it, and hit subscribe to help me keep the flame alive for the hearts that thought they had gone dark. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey.